Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends.
Here in episode 77, we're joined by Matt McLelland. He's Vice President of Sustainability and Innovation at Covenant, where we talk about why he loves his role at the truckload carrier. He brags about the strides the trucking industry has made on reducing carbon and explains the green premium. He also shares his thoughts on why he is a huge fan of renewable diesel and the fact that there is a lot for the trucking industry to be excited about. Today we have joining us Matt McLelland. He's the Vice President of Sustainability and Innovation at Covenant. Pretty exciting title there, right? Covenant, a truckload carrier, and the fact that they have a VP of Sustainability and Innovation is fantastic. So great to have you on today, Matt. Looking forward to this.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mike. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you know, the title of this, and now I've done this almost 80 times. So, you know, the title of this podcast that we came up with right away was Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends. And I turn away a lot of people who want to be on this podcast that I say, you know, you're not a friend yet. So once we become friends, maybe you can qualify. But you remember how we became friends, Matt?
Oh, I remember exactly how that happened, Mike. It was at a trade show. Help me remember the name of it. It's the one that we don't have anymore. NACV or
V. So yeah, there was NACV, North American Commercial Vehicle.
It was huge.
Event, and
it was huge and a boondoggle. I don't know who put it together, but it wasn't affiliated with like ATA or TCA or any of the big events, and it was massive. It was in Atlanta, Georgia, I think, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was put on by the same group that does the Hanover show every other year. And their concept was less on, you know, conference and panels and speakers and more on, you know, the trade show and creating experiences in the trade show. And we had the finale event for both the first Run on Less in 17 and then the Run on Less regional in 19. The finale event was held there. So we may have met at a NACFE event located at NACV. Yeah. Tell us about yourself, Matt. I mean, what's your background? What's your career? What brought you to Covenant? And then ultimately, what are you doing today?
Yeah. So I'm 53 years old. I guess you can volunteer stuff like that these days. You can't ask it, right? But I was in IT for most of my career. I joined Covenant about 5 years ago, and really to run their innovation and sustainability initiatives. And I guess what that means is they identified, I want to say earlier than most, that there were a lot of things that we weren't doing that we needed to start researching, piloting, budgeting for. You know, if your listeners are carriers like Covenant, and I mean, it's hard enough just to keep the wheels on the bus, right? Just to maintain trucks and to keep them maintained and to, you know, get in the new trucks and put them out on the road. And that doesn't always really leave a lot of time to really focus on what the future is like. And back in 2018, a bunch of interesting things were happening. There was a lot of talk about electrification. There was starting to be some talk about autonomous. There was starting to be some talk about environmental concerns, you know, under the umbrella of like global warming and what was corporate's involvement and things like that. And so Covenant just felt like it was a good opportunity to have somebody on staff full time that had a lot of time dedicated to spending time with startups, spending time with OEMs, learning about what customers were asking for. And so we created this position, sustainability and innovation position. And, you know, really within a year, so in early 2019, we had customers regularly, both existing and prospects, Mike, asking us, what do you think about these topics? And guess what? We had answers because I'd been spending a lot of time looking at it. And so we can sort of unpack that a little bit more. But today, you know, I run our ESG or our CSR ESG initiatives. You know, I'm the one that pretty much tracks what the SEC is going to require of large companies, specifically publicly traded companies like Covenant. You know, I get to work with a lot of our friends, including some of the folks at NACFE, about CARB and the ACF rule and what types of solutions do we need to be looking at. So it's a great role. I love it. I just had an annual performance review, and you know, we kind of talked about what does the future for you look like here. And I really don't want any other job in our company other than the one that I've got, because I love it. I love getting up every day doing it. It's like you, Mike. You love your job, right? Can you imagine doing anything else?
No, I can't. And you know, I think what they're allowing you to do is as well be a bit of a voice for the industry around these things. I mean, we see each other quite often. We've even spoken on similar panels, and I think what Matt, you and I maybe each bring to the industry is like a reality check on all of this. So if I take myself back 10 years ago, we were coming off of diesel exhaust emissions, the whole we could talk about climate and global warming, but 10 years ago, it was still, how do I get my freight and what's the cost? And over the last 10 years, we've seen a movement to not only time and cost, but how are you moving it? What kind of trucks are you using? What kind of emissions are those trucks creating? Or are they old trucks that are we don't have a lot of the heavy NOx and particulate matter trucks anymore, but we do have trucks with much worse fuel economy. And so now I think we're being asked more about that. So let's dive into that a little bit. So you're saying that Covenant's customers are asking you questions in their normal contracting for freight around sustainability. I mean, how does that show up in the real world, Matt?
Yeah, so let me start by kind of bragging on where our industry has gone without anybody forcing us to. So there's a statistic, and specifically a graphic on the ATA's website. In fact, I've gotten permission for us to use it in our upcoming CSR report, that says the average truck on the road today has 98% fewer particulate matter and NOx than your average truck did back in 1988. So just think about that for a second. So and then they have a graphic that shows 60 of today's trucks equal about one of today's a truck back in 1988 as it relates to emissions. So we've come a long way, Mike, and I don't think the industry always gets credit for that. We weren't forced to do it. It was just part of fuel economy and just being thoughtful about the environment. And so, the average age of Covenant's truck is 2.1 years. We consider a newer fleet being the most efficient fleet. Obviously, it's a cleaner truck because it turns more often. It's helpful with driver recruiting and other things. And so I think most of the large fleets probably have it between 2 and 3 years, I think is the industry standard. Your smaller fleets and your owner operators, the average age in the industry is 6.7 years for a truck. And obviously there's some a lot older than that. And a lot of that's going to change, and if you and I had like a 5-hour podcast that would bore most people to tears, right? We could go into details about how, some of the California port requirements are going to be, outlawing trucks beyond a certain age because of emissions. And there's just a lot of things that's going to be different about our industry over the next couple of years as it relates to regulation. But we run a newer fleet. A lot of our competitors do the same thing. And while we still have a ways to go, we're a lot better off than we were 20 years ago. I mean, you were a Navistar guy for a long time, and you watched firsthand how the innovations they made in their trucks were big, right?
Yeah, and the way we look back at, like, let's just say history is the cost of fuel drove a lot of these decisions. And we had a pretty we had times where fuel prices were high, we had times when they were low. When they were high, we all worked on fuel efficiency and those things, and when it was low, we sort of ignored it. We forgot about it. We drove faster. We bought trucks with less aerodynamics. We saved money on this and that and the other because the fuel cost wasn't there. And then now we've been through I would call it like 8 of the last 10 years, we've been around $4 diesel. And so we got kind of a new world here of higher fuel prices. And that then has us all thinking about just that. And then there's these regulations that, whether it's the greenhouse gas rule for fuel economy or the zero emission things that are coming out of California and the MOU states, but as well, this last item that we talk about a lot, and you've brought up already on this podcast, is that, just a drive to being more sustainable. So, I see shippers now asking, if not requiring, carriers to say, to explain, what's your fuel efficiency, or what's your, what are you doing around electric trucks or natural gas? Those are questions that shippers didn't used to ask. They were only just about, get my freight from point A to point B and what's the cost. And I do think that's showing up as a real change in our industry. It's just not regulations.
Right. Well, you make a great point, and let me make it a little bit more nuanced, right? Because, I feel like I get into this debate sometimes with some of our leadership, but, we talk about fuel economy. I talk about carbon reduction. Our customers so we did a big ROI a few years ago on the value of electric APUs. Okay, so for those in the audience that may not know what those are devices that charge up while the truck is running, these big battery banks, and it makes them able to run air conditioning and heating and HVAC, basically HVAC and electrical appliances and things while the driver is at rest, whether that's, during a sleep cycle or dwell times at a yard or waiting at the port. So these devices, traditional ROI, you put all the cost savings into a spreadsheet, the biggest one being fuel reduction, and you pencil it out and you decide whether or not the thing makes sense economically over the life of the truck. So we ran that number and it was pretty much right on the edge, right? We weren't going to lose money, but we weren't going to make money. But the part of it that I think we have to start thinking about now as carriers that are more thoughtful about are the emissions. Right. So it may not pencil out on the economics, but the emission reduction, the idle reduction is tremendous. So what's the value of that? And so I would sit with our CFO and we'd look at it like, okay, let's put in a number for the value of carbon reduction. He looked at me like I was crazy because that's not traditionally part of an ROI. But now, Mike, I'm seeing lots of decisions that we're having to make as an industry on CapEx investments that may not necessarily pay off for a financial ROI unless you can change your rates and recoup some of that money somewhere else. So, I call it the social ROI, right? I call it the part of the return that you can't calculate like numerically in a very specific way, but it's something that you can't ignore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And so for a long time, NACV, when we look at benefits and challenges of technologies, and then we try to monetize that in ROI calculations. One of the ways we look at it, Matt, is hard costs, soft costs, and then we've always struggled with the third, like softer or very difficult to monetize costs. And when I say cost, that's both benefits and expenses. So, one of the things we believe we've discovered with electric trucks in our run on less and other investigations is that drivers love them. So if drivers really love these trucks, and I believe they do, and I've said it, that I expect in my 50-year career, I'm at 38 years now, but I expect that there will be that the driver attraction around electric trucks will be the biggest thing that maybe in my whole career, because I believe in it. So okay, so let's just play with that for a minute and say yes, that's going to happen. That people who deploy electric trucks are going to have more retention of drivers and an easier way to attract them. Well, that saves carriers money. Whether you're, whoever you are. But, it's hard to calculate, hard to monetize. Is 5%, 2%, 20%? What kind of cost savings is that? But it's that it is real. I think the same thing holds with some of these, sustainability pieces, your carbon or emissions pieces you're talking about. And I do think for a while here, and, we're going to see some shippers be willing to pay more for some freight being moved more sustainably. We actually saw that a bit with natural gas years ago. And, maybe, you even using electric APUs or other things to improve your carbon footprint of these trucks vis-a-vis saving money on fuel, but having an expense to lay out there. Maybe some shippers might recognize that and help you with those costs. Maybe not everybody, but maybe a handful. So I think we're starting to see some. I think we need to be creative in those ROIs. The old school of if it doesn't pay back in 18 months with hard costs, then I'm not doing it. Is kind of old school.
Yeah. So in the industry, we call it the green premium, right? And the big joke is, customers are asking for it, shippers are asking for it, but once you give them the number of what it's going to cost, they're unwilling to pay for it. And so, I think a year ago, that's kind of the way a lot of these conversations went. But just this year, and I told our board of directors this when I presented to them late last year, that I felt like 2023 was going to be kind of the tipping point, that we were going to start seeing shippers willing to pay more to meet these, carbon goals that they've met as an organization. And so, we're starting to see it. I'm not seeing it at the level that I would like. So in other words,
right.
I'm a huge fan of electrification where it makes sense. but I'm not going to go broke doing it, right? And so
Yeah, so let me ask you a question right there. Oftentimes I will hear, you hear people talking about, decarbonizing freight movement or decarbonizing trucks. And a lot of folks think or even talk about that being, well, that's zero emission trucks, that's electric trucks or hydrogen fuel cell trucks. And, we're at NACV quick to say, whoa, wait a minute. If you take your diesel truck from 6 to 8 mile per gallon, you've done a hell of a decarbonization. You're not at zero, but you're burning a lot less fuel to move the same amount of freight. I guess I'm sure you believe that, right? The way you're talking about EAPUs and other things, but do you see that dynamic in the marketplace, and how do you talk through it, in the real world of Covenant?
So, okay, at the risk of sounding like an advertisement for NACV and the great work and the papers that you guys do, but your messy middle paper, which by the way, if your listeners haven't downloaded that, it's a fantastic paper. I've made a reference to it in the latest CSR report that we're about to put out next week. But these sort of bridge technologies, as you and I like to call them, are a perfect solution for things that we can do today that may or may not add a substantial amount of cost to the way we do business. I'll give you a great example. And I talk about this a lot. Anybody listening to your podcast that's heard me speak before will know that I'm a huge fan of renewable diesel. This is a product that you can put in your truck today that's better for the engine, significantly fewer greenhouse gas emissions, less soot, less regens, better for the engine. The OEMs prefer it. And the price point is pretty similar to regular diesel, and you can put it in your truck right now. And it doesn't give you better fuel economy. It doesn't necessarily give you more power, although anecdotally, our drivers have reported that the cetane level feels like it's a little higher. So it does have a little bit more pep. But here's a product that basically doesn't do anything for the customer, but it does give tremendously better results from the tailpipe. That's something that we can do right now.
Yep.
And it's interesting. I'll just say this one last thing, because I know you've got a couple of thoughts on this, but I've got a friend, Keith Wilson, who owns a small fleet of 45 trucks up in Portland, Oregon. He's proponent of this, of a plan. It's called SB 803. It's legislation that they just introduced to make renewable diesel the only product available in the state of Oregon at the pump. And I ended up getting into a debate with a guy that was also testifying against it, because his approach, Mike, was we don't need to be putting money into bridge technologies. We need to be investing our resources in true zero emission vehicles, which, by the way, are so far in advance, especially as it relates to trucking. So there are things that we can do today, and a lot of your reports detail what those are. Renewable diesel being one of them. There's a lot of things for us to be excited about, things that we can do today. It's not a super, super long list, but it's definitely a list. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, after we issued the messy middle report, I blogged, that we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And what I meant by that is, yes, we've got a big hill to climb on electric and hydrogen, and we need to go about that, because those are like the home runs in a baseball analogy. But the things that we can do now are really important to, moving runners around the bases, instead of a home run. And, too many analogies there in my comment, Matt. But my point is that we can do both, the lower hanging fruit, the things that are available now, whether it's renewable diesel, whether it's aerodynamics, whether it's really working with your drivers and thinking through speed limits and speed, which can really affect fuel economy, depending on your routes and what kind of business you're in. A lot of those things, and spoiler alert, but those things that we do on diesel trucks today will help us with the range of electric trucks tomorrow and next decade. So, I think not only should we do these various things, they build upon each other, and it's really important to do that. I do want to get into, Covenant. You do a lot of team driving, a lot of long haul, and so this is even a bigger pertinent conversation for you, because like you said earlier, the electric and hydrogen's not here yet, and electric is range constrained. So this whole how do we do more with less diesel is really top of mind probably for Covenant's management today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There are again, our customers are really asking questions about needle moving solutions and not these kind of, I don't want to call them boring because I don't want to make them sound like they're not worth doing, but putting a bunch of trailer skirts on a trailer is not fun like a hydrogen powered truck is, right? But we just ran a test. We were able to put a combination of products on a trailer that gets us between 8 and 10% operating efficiency over what was there before. Like that's huge, right? And Mike, you brought up a good point. Take that trailer, put it in an electric truck, and now you got even better performance, right? So, there's just a lot of things that you can still do. And, a lot of them are very debatable. You and I talked about these on a group call that we had just a few hours ago with some of the other industry leaders that you get together with on a regular basis to kind of bounce ideas off of. I got into a debate with a guy or discussion one about wheel covers, right? There's a certain amount of efficiency that comes from wheel covers, but it discourages people from doing air pressure checks on their walk around on a pre-trip inspection. So, everything's got a pro and a con. And I'm just glad, Mike, that you coordinate and you coordinate events for people like me to get together and sort of talk about this with my peers. Because if there's anything I like more about my job is that I can work with competitors to help talk through and spitball ideas that we all need to be doing together as an industry, not as competitors.
Yeah, so we're starting to run out of time, Matt, and I'd like to wrap it up with this sort of question for you. And throughout this conversation, we've been talking about discussions and debates and arguments with different people. And I think we're in this, we're in the decarbonization of freight movement. We can see, and we've been doing incredible fuel economy gains over the last decade. You talked about emissions reductions in the pollutant emissions. We're definitely in this, and there's a long way to go before we get to true zero. But what's your advice? I mean, we've got a lot of startups that see the opportunity here with some great ideas, whether it's in, load matching all the way to technologies and new truck builders. In a final question, how do you suggest we all act today and next week around these dynamics, which are, I'm convinced we're in a transformation, which means we're not into just change, we're into significant change. So what's your advice to the industry and how we can be successful coming through this?
I don't think everybody's in a position to go out and kind of hire like a Matt, right, to run all the sustainability innovation initiatives. But I do think there's people in every organization that could probably carve out. It would have to be very intentional from the C-level down, but say 20-25% of their job to spend time looking at solutions like this. Whether that means going to the ACT Expo and looking at all the different things that are available on the floor where they have all the providers that come in and show their wares, but going to conferences, learning, attending or, downloading white papers like yours. There are things out there, Mike, that we're trying and experimenting with. There's a company called Remora that we just signed a deal with to get some of their products next year that is direct carbon capture out of the tailpipe. We are looking at, more electric APUs across our fleet. We just signed a deal. This is interesting, and I'll kind of end with this, but there's a little startup here in Chattanooga called Repower. So they are trying to make money with companies like us that have excess trailers that are just sitting around idle. They'll rent them from us for short periods of time so that we can get revenue. But what's more important is they reposition those trailers. So we rent the trailer like, you can rent these 5 trailers in San Francisco, California, but I need them back on this date and I need them in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So they'll not only rent the trailer from us, but they'll also deliver them to where we need them. So the repositioning of trailers and the expense that we used to have using fully, empty trailers, moving them around the country is huge. I never would have thought a company would start up to do that, but these kids did. So there's a lot.
I would characterize that as like the digital economy and the sharing economy, right? Where, maybe, I share my neighbor's power washer, or I buy one, he buys one, we share it. I mean, here's got a case where you're sharing trailers. I think you're exactly right. And I think being open to these ideas and looking at where any idea can come from, whether it's a startup or traditional, and then acting on them and not being afraid to work on some of these small initiatives because every little bit helps.
Yeah, no, and listen, thanks for having me on your show. I have listened to I do a lot of road trips like you do, so I listen to everything from Joe Rogan podcast to your podcast. Thanks for doing what you do, and again, I always enjoy the people that you choose to have on. I'm flattered that you picked me for this week, so thanks again.
Freight Efficiency with NACV's Mike Roth and Friends.